What are the differences between Yuji and Sukuna's versions of Shrine? And could Yuji ever perform the world-cutting slash? Let's talk about it, but spoilers beware. Okay, first of all, shout out to my guy Mech for inspiring this video today. And he had a few questions about Yuji's version of Shrine and how that differs from Sukuna's, ultimately culminating in the question of could Yuji use the world-cutting slash? So y'all pause to read Mech's full thoughts here because he said he would love to get everyone's opinion on this, but we will address all of the things he's talking about here. So first of all, Mech says, is it confirmed that the reason Yuji's dismantle, which should be long range, is instead touch based like Sukuna's cleave because Yuji made a binding vow to only hit the barrier between souls specifically and to make that more effective? Or is that only headcanon in theory? And I would say no. I would say that that is confirmed because we have Sukuna recognize what Yuji is doing and then say he must have made a binding vow to target my soul. So while it wasn't the narrator stating that, we can't really get a more reliable source than Sukuna, the master of the shrine technique, the one with far more experience with it, and the master of binding vows and an absolute genius at jujutsu, right? So even though this is called dismantle, which again is Sukuna's long-range slash, for Yuji, it's a contact slash because of that binding vow he made. So the trade-off there would be he's sacrificing the range of the slash in order for it to have this potent soul-splitting capability. A good way to think about this is the fact that both Yuji and Sukuna both have Shrine, the exact same curse technique. However, they're going to use it and interpret it in different ways, which is going to cause the technique to manifest differently, right? Which is why we see Yuji interpret it with those scissors and cut lines, something we never saw from Sukuna. But what we know about Shrine, thanks to the narrator, is that dismantle is the default slash. So you could think of Shrine as just cutting attacks that are able to be sent from range. And the name for that is dismantle. And the narration continues to say that, however, cleave is a version of the slash that requires touch, but can have its potency adjusted. It can be stronger, right? So another way to look at that could be that, okay, Shrine's slashes are called dismantles. But then Sukuna used a binding vow where he said, hey, I'll sacrifice the range for more attack potency. Whereas Yuji said, hey, I'll sacrifice the range for this soul property. So something that Mech said was that he was frustrated that Gege gave Yuji Shrine and yet we didn't get to see him use it in the way Sukuna did. We didn't see these long range slashes or these powerful cleaves. And so what I would say is that both of those things are likely possible for Yuji to do. It's just that they weren't relevant in this context, right? Because Yuji wasn't trying to just cut up or kill Sukuna. He was trying to strip Sukuna away from Megami. And in light of that, these soul dismantles and Yuji's specific binding vow of sacrificing the range for that soul potency was exactly what he needed to be doing. Now, I will say that, could Yuji emulate the exact same binding vow as Sukuna and have his version of cleave? I think so, but will it look and act exactly like Sukuna's? Maybe not, because again, we see that the way he envisions it is with these scissors and these cutting lines. So the way that he envisions his version of cleave might also be different, but considering he has the exact same toolkit as Sukuna, he should likely at least be able to do his version of those things that Sukuna was doing. And then to add on to that, Mech wanted to know that if Yuji did have his own ranged version of the slash, would it be invisible the same way that Sukuna's dismantles are? No one can see that unless, your Mahoraga that's adapted to it. You have heavenly restricted level senses like Maki and Toji, or if you've got something like the Six Eyes, right? And I would assume so. Since they are both using Shrine, I would imagine that Yuji slashes are similarly imperceptible except for those extreme circumstances. Then next Mech says, if Yuji and Sukuna's curse techniques are identical, but they simply just choose to use it differently, then couldn't Yuji make the same binding vows as Sukuna in relation to the furnace, in relation to the fire arrow? Basically asking, could Yuji combine his version of the fire arrow with his domain expansion to create that thermobaric explosion the same way Sukuna did? And I think so, because again, they do have the same curse technique. They're working with the same toolkit, the same raw materials. Yuji should be able to make the same binding vows and combine those things in the same way. However, much easier said than done, right? Because Sukuna doing something is different than just anyone doing it. Yuji knows it's possible, sure, but that doesn't mean he has the requisite underlying understanding of all of the things at play, right? And certainly he's got a nice leg up on it. And again, I do think it's possible, but I don't think it's just a matter of him being able to do that instantly because he knows it's possible. I do think it will take training. And just to add on to that, although I'm sure this goes without saying at this point, is that Yuji's interpretation of the furnace may be completely different in the first place, right? The same way that he thought of the scissors, right? Maybe he envisions the way to use the furnace just in a completely different way where it wouldn't even make sense for him to make those same binding vows as Sukuna, right? But again, that's not really what Mech was asking. He was just saying, would it be theoretically possible for him to make those same binding vows? And I do think so. However, I think it would be cool if we just saw him use it in a completely new and unique way. And then finally, that leads us to Mech's last part of his question here, which was, do I think Yuji has the potential to use the world-cutting slash? And let's just break this down. So first of all, Sukuna learned the world-cutting slash through Mahoraga, right? That's the only reason he was able to develop that. So I know some people would think that no, Yuji can't do it because he doesn't have the 10 shadows, but that's actually not true. You don't need the 10 shadows to perform the world-cutting slash. Sukuna just needed Mahoraga to teach him how to do it. So it's not as if you needed an aspect of the 10 shadows in order to amplify Shrine in that way. Mahoraga was simply his teacher. So it's based on Sukuna's own understanding and own genius that he was able to then emulate that, which he explains after he bisects Gojo, right? He talks about the first time Mahoraga adapted to the Limitless, it was something I couldn't copy. But then the second time he did, I could. He basically taught me to expand the target of my technique to existence itself. So that's what the world cutting slash does. Now, how does Sukuna do that? Great question. And I think there is where we chalk it up to his genius, right? So all that to say is that Yuji could theoretically perform the world cutting slash. Any character in Jujutsu Kaisen could theoretically perform the world cutting insert whatever their technique does, like if it makes sense, obviously, like the world cutting purple, you know what I mean? Like whatever you want to say, it's if you understand what targeting existence itself means and if you understand how to apply that to your jujutsu. So very long-winded here, but Yuji could theoretically do it. He has an example that it is possible, which is like the biggest, cheat code to it even entering your mind of being conceivable, right? Sukuna just had to, imagine that it was possible, but Yuji has proof that it is, right? So that certainly gives him a leg up, but I don't think Yuji has the same genius that Sukuna does. I don't know if he will be able to apply that knowledge in the same way. But again, knowing it's possible is a huge leg up in that regard. But in the same way that, I know it's humanly possible to do a 360 windmill dunk because I saw LeBron James do it, I'm never doing that no matter how much time you give me. So anyways, that's my 2 cents on all of this. Mech, I hope it was helpful in some form or fashion, but y'all please let me know all of your thoughts down in the comments below. And as always, thank you for watching.